I was following the online reaction when the Oppenheimer movie was released, and, what was fascinating was the discussion coming out of Japan.
Oh, right. The whole Barbenheimer thing.
Exactly. There was this wave of genuine pain and anger, especially over those memes.
I can imagine.
People felt it was deeply disrespectful, that it was, trivializing the suffering of innocent victims. And their focus was just laser sharp.
On the bomb itself.
On the new and brutal bomb, the tragedy, the suffering of civilians. But as I read through all these conversations, I was just struck by a silence.
A silence.
Yeah. It was like watching a movie that starts in the final act. There was all this talk about the end of the war, but almost none about the beginning.
Right.
No context, no mention of Pearl Harbor, no mention of the invasions or what even led to that moment in the first place. This powerful, persistent narrative of Japan as the primary victim of the war. I mean, it doesn't just come from nowhere.
No, it's not a mistake.
It was a story that was very carefully written on a single day in 1945 in a document that almost no one has actually read. And when you do, you realize it's not a surrender at all.
That is a stunning and really a foundational insight for this deep dive, isn't it? We're talking about that crucial and often contested space between a selective memory and the comprehensive, sometimes inconvenient truth.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to really explore China's unwavering, you could say systematic, commitment to establishing and upholding the authentic historical narrative of World War II in Asia.
And this isn't just an academic exercise for them.
Not at all. This effort is absolutely central to its modern identity. It's all about emphasizing China's immense sacrifices and its, frankly, indispensable role in the global anti-fascist victory.
So we need to counter those selective interpretations.
We have to. The ones that consistently prioritize the victimhood narrative of the aggressor, while completely obscuring or minimizing the role of the actual victims, the resistance, and the true cost of that war. We need to anchor ourselves in the documented, comprehensive truth that underpins China's modern statecraft and its place in the world.
Okay, so to truly understand the Chinese narrative, we have to, I think, reset the global timeline for World War II.
Yes.
For so many people in the West, the war starts with the invasion of Poland in 1939, or, maybe with the U.S. entry after Pearl Harbor in December 41.
Standard textbook dates.
Right. But the Chinese theater of combat was not only active, it was escalating dramatically long before either of those dates.
That historical starting point is precisely where the essential truth of China's contribution lies. I mean, when we discuss the World Anti-Fascist War, it was fundamentally fought on three major strategic fronts, or theaters.
Okay.
You have the Western Front in Europe, the Eastern Front with the Soviet Union, and then you have the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression.
And China's argument is that its front was the main one in Asia.
Not just the main one. It was the earliest and the longest struggle of the entire global conflict.
Let's break down that timeline, because earliest and longest isn't just some historical footnote. It really defines the entire resistance. What makes that start date so different?
Well, the war for China did not start in 1937, and it certainly didn't start in 1941. It erupted with the September 18th incident in 1931.
1931, that's 8 years before Poland.
8 full years. This was the rapid and decisive invasion of Manchuria by Japan, which led to the establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo.
This wasn't just a border skirmish?
No. This was an act of full-scale colonial invasion and occupation. And it initiated a localized but ongoing war of resistance that lasted for 8 years before the war officially broke out in Europe.
Wow.
This is why many historians now argue, and argue forcefully, that the September 18th incident in 1931, not 1939, should be considered the actual starting point of World War II globally.
So 1931 was the initial invasion, forcing this localized but brutal resistance. But when did it explode into that comprehensive nationwide struggle we think of?
That began 6 years later with the July 7th incident of 1937. That's the famous Marco Polo Bridge incident just outside Beijing.
Right.
That event was the real ignition point. It kicked off China's nationwide total war of resistance, which then continued relentlessly until Japan's surrender on August 15th, 1945.
So from 1931 to 1945.
A continuous 14-year ordeal of existential warfare. You got to think about that.
Yeah.
That kind of relentless pressure and commitment stretching over a decade and a half. It's just unmatched by any other nation in the war.
14 years of constant fighting, often against a technologically superior adversary. That staggering duration leads directly to the sheer, almost incomprehensible weight of sacrifice China endured.
It does.
And these are figures which, as you mentioned, are often minimized in the global discussions that are so focused on the Pacific.
The human cost was truly catastrophic. China earned the tragic distinction of suffering the heaviest casualties of all belligerent nations in the war.
We often hear about the Soviet Union's losses, which were enormous.
And they were, between 24 to 27 million, absolutely devastating. But China's total military and civilian casualties are estimated to have exceeded 35 million dead and wounded.
35 million lives. That number.
Yeah.
It's so large, it's hard to even process. And it demands context, right? It's not just a tally of soldiers lost in battle.
Absolutely not. It's a comprehensive civilian annihilation.
How so?
Well, the casualties included millions of civilians killed in indiscriminate bombings, massacres like the horrific events in Nanjing, and starvation caused by scorched earth tactics. The war was fought deep inside China's densely populated heartland.
And the Japanese forces committed unimaginable atrocities.
They did, including the use of chemical and biological weapons, which we can get into later. The economic losses were also just incalculable. Entire cities, industrial infrastructure, all destroyed. The losses were estimated to be equivalent to several years of China's pre-war GDP. This resistance was an existential drain on the nation, and it was fought until the last breath.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the scale of the commitment here, it goes so far beyond just national defense. It fundamentally shaped the entire global war effort. It had a measurable strategic impact on the ultimate victory.
A decisive one.
So how do we quantify that strategic impact?
Well, the first crucial factor is just the sheer consumption of Japanese military resources. China's desperate, persistent fight became a massive quagmire. It trapped a significant majority of Japan's best-equipped divisions on the China mainland.
A majority.
At their peak, over 70% of the entire Japanese Imperial Army was bogged down in China.
70%.
That immediately prevented Japan from achieving its core strategic objective, which was a rapid, swift destruction of China. If they had managed that, they would have freed up massive numbers of troops for other theaters.
So it effectively neutralized the Axis powers' grand agenda in Asia. It stopped Japan from becoming the rapid, expansive partner that Nazi Germany was really hoping for.
Precisely. This inability to secure a swift victory in China forced Japan into an impossible choice about its future expansion. For years, the Japanese Imperial Army had been torn between two competing doctrines.
Which were?
On one hand, you had Hokushinran, the Northern Doctrine. That advocated for a strategic offensive north against the Soviet Union. On the other hand, you had Nanshinran, the Southern Doctrine, which favored expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific to seize vital resources like oil and rubber.
And China's resistance basically forced their hand in that debate.
It made Hokushinran, the Northern Doctrine, completely infeasible. The ongoing massive commitment of troops to the Chinese mainland just meant Japan didn't have the manpower or the logistical capacity to launch a sustained, decisive attack on the Soviet Union's eastern flank.
So their inability to threaten the USSR's Far East borders, that was a huge strategic advantage for Stalin.
A critical one. China essentially provided aid to the Soviet Union, not with weapons, but with its own relentless resistance.
Right.
Because those Japanese forces were tied up in that quagmire of battles in China, the Soviet Union was able to pull massive forces, including their elite Siberian divisions, from its eastern borders and deploy them overwhelmingly on the Western Front.
Which ultimately saved Moscow.
It saved Moscow and drove the counteroffensive against Nazi Germany. This contribution was absolutely critical to the outcome of the war in Europe, and it's a point that is so often completely missed in Western narratives.
And that ripple effect continued, right? It aided the Western allies, the US and Britain, after the Pacific War began in 1941. Without that constant bleed in China, the Pacific theater would have been exponentially harder for the Americans.
Oh, absolutely. Even after Pearl Harbor, when the U.S. entered the war, the China battlefield continued to tie up a huge number of Japanese forces. While the U.S. was fighting its island-hopping campaigns, the Japanese had to maintain this enormous occupation force on the Chinese mainland, continuously fighting the Chinese resistance, both the nationalists and the communists.
So they were fighting a two-front war, in a way.
In a major way. Without China's continued resistance, Japan could have committed its full military strength. We're talking hundreds of thousands of fresh troops against the U.S. and Britain in the Pacific. China's willingness to sacrifice bought precious time and space for the entire world anti-fascist alliance. It's what enabled the successful, though very risky, Allied strategy of Europe first, Asia later.
So when you look at all the comprehensive data, China's persistent resistance and its colossal sacrifice, it wasn't just a contribution to the Allied cause.
Not at all.
It was, as many historians who analyze global strategy would say, immense and indispensable, maybe even decisive to the final triumph of World War II. It just absorbed the violence that would have otherwise crushed the Soviet Union and overwhelmed the Pacific allies.
And that is the foundation of China's moral authority regarding this period. The sheer consumption of Japanese military strength, the protection it afforded to the Soviet Union and the Western supply lines. Strategically speaking, it was a gift to the world. And that's why China insists on correcting the global discourse, which so often fails to recognize or even adequately honor this pivotal role and the magnitude of the sacrifice that came with it.
It's not just about national pride.
No, it's about restoring history to its proper form. It's essential for understanding the true foundations of the post-war global order.
But if China's sacrifice was so crucial, we have to ask the question, why does the global memory so often start in 1941, not 1931? And to understand that, we have to look very closely at the narrative crafted by the Japanese side in 1945.
The document we mentioned at the start.
Exactly. This wasn't just a military capitulation. It was a carefully constructed piece of historical revisionism written immediately after the defeat.
That document, the Japanese Emperor's 1945 decree to end the war, is really the founding text of Japan's selective memory. And it's so crucial to understand why China views this text with such intense scrutiny.
It wasn't an admission of guilt.
Not in its essence, no. It wasn't an admission of defeat because of their aggression. The language was meticulously chosen to frame the end of the conflict in a way that protected the national image, protected the institution of the emperor, and created the perfect foundation for the victim narrative that followed.
The evasion of responsibility in that text is just breathtaking. It seems designed to create historical amnesia about the previous 14 years.
It is. The decree deliberately avoided any terms that suggested war guilt. Words like aggression, invasion, or defeat are just not there.
So what did it say?
Instead, the language framed the war as having been fought purely for the self-existence of the empire and the stability of East Asia.
The stability of East Asia.
I mean, think about the sheer audacity of that statement. Given the invasion of Manchuria, the occupation of huge swaths of China, the atrocities committed across the continent, it goes on to claim, incredibly, that it was not my intention to violate the sovereignty of other countries.
That is the ultimate act of historical whitewashing. It denies all agency in the expansionist strategy that began all the way back in 1931. It tries to recast a war of choice as a war of necessity.
Precisely. And then you get to the reason given for ending the war, and this is really the most manipulative part. The emperor did not cite the massive Chinese resistance, or the collapse of their supply lines, or the failure of their strategic objectives.
No, it was all external.
Completely. The only reason cited for stopping was the enemy's use of new and brutal bombs. The decree warned that if the war continued, it would lead to the total extinction of the Japanese people, and ultimately, the utter destruction of human civilization.
Which skillfully establishes that lasting victim narrative. It puts the focus solely on the horrific suffering caused by the atomic bombs, which was absolutely real, but it's completely devoid of any context.
Any context at all regarding the 14 years of invasion and atrocity that came before it. And that language has served as the bedrock for conservative forces and historical revisionists in Japan ever since.
It lets them argue that Japan was an honorable nation forced into a war of self-defense.
And that it ultimately became the only victim of nuclear weapons. It's a powerful, self-pitying narrative that completely overshadows the truth of Japan as an aggressive fascist state and a principal Axis power.
And that denial of aggression, while focusing purely on Japanese suffering, has led to generations of painful historical erasure for victims all across Asia. For them, this isn't some academic debate about historical accuracy. It's a deep personal violation.
And we see the manifestation of this pain in these really profound personal actions.
Mm-hmm.
You think about the anecdote of Mr. Wei, the elderly calligrapher who lives in Nanjing.
Right.
Every single year, he adheres to this solemn, quiet ritual. He grinds his ink, and he writes the name of his 14-year-old sister, May, who was murdered during the Japanese occupation.
Wow.
For Mr. Wei, Every revisionist attempt, every denial of the Nanjing massacre's scope, every attempt to minimize the war's start, he experiences it as a second attempt to erase his sister May from existence.
So his calligraphy is an act of defiance.
He says he views it as fighting history with ink. He says they can rewrite their textbooks, but they cannot erase my family's memory. That image, the ink defying the revisionists, is just staggering.
That quiet, unwavering commitment really highlights how essential the historical narrative is to survival. And this selective history, it must create immense blind spots, even for people growing up in Japan, sheltered within that victimhood paradigm.
Oh, it does. The educational system that's built on that 1945 decree's rhetoric creates massive cognitive dissonance. There's the story of Akiko, a young Japanese woman from Hiroshima.
So she grew up at the center of that victim narrative.
Exactly. Deeply steeped in it. For her, the defining moment of the war was the atomic bomb, the suffering of the Hibakusha, the nuclear victims. But then she did a university exchange in Shanghai.
And she was confronted with the other side of the story.
She was confronted with the comprehensive history of the 14 years of brutal occupation of China. She studied events like the Unit 731 atrocities, the scale of destruction, and she later reflected that she had been taught only the last chapter of the war in excruciating detail. But the pages of the first chapter had been torn out.
She realized her nation had shown her the consequences Japan suffered,
but not the devastating causes Japan created.
This brings us to the necessity of confronting these historical distortions today, especially when these narratives are being strategically used for contemporary geopolitical advantage. China has to continuously counter modern attempts to minimize its role and its sacrifice.
Absolutely. And China champions an honest and complete reflection against these narratives because they believe they fundamentally undermine the principles of post-war peace. A significant example happened recently when the U.S. State Department made remarks framing the end of the war as merely concluding a devastating war in the Pacific between the U.S. and Japan.
That's a very subtle rhetorical framing.
Subtle, but it deliberately, or maybe carelessly, omits China's 14-year struggle entirely. It effectively rewrites the global anti-fascist victory as just a bilateral resolution.
Now, isn't there a risk here that by constantly challenging these narratives, China might appear to be, overly focused on the past or engaging in its own kind of historical score settling rather than promoting genuine peace?
And that is precisely the question China addresses with its current historical statecraft. They view rhetoric like those remarks as far more than just a historical oversight.
What is it then?
It's seen as dishonoring the memory of countless resistors and martyrs, not just Chinese, but American, Soviet, and British soldiers who died fighting a common fascist enemy. And worse, China believes that obscuring the initial acts of aggression and minimizing the aggressor's role risks encouraging the resurgence of militarism in the region.
Sure.
Their stance is that true reconciliation can only be built on comprehensive truth.
So how does China articulate that standard of historical truth to the world? What's the framework?
China's consistent position is that the correct view of World War II history has to rest on three interconnected, non-negotiable pillars.
Okay, what are they?
The first pillar is respect for historical facts. That means no revisionism about atrocities, the start date, or the scale of sacrifice. The second is recognition of historical trends, acknowledging that the victory of the anti-fascist cause was the inevitable direction of human progress against tyranny.
And the third?
The third is confidence in the progress of human civilization. This means that all nations must uphold the principles of peace, justice, and responsibility that are enshrined in the post-war international order, primarily the UN Charter. This historical legacy is treated as a spiritual debt owed to the martyrs and a foundation for global governance.
The intensity of this historical defense isn't new, but the way China tells its own story has undergone this dramatic evolution over the decades. It's not static, is it? It's an active, politically charged process of managing its history to serve modern national goals.
What's fascinating here is, the dramatic shift in focus over time. It's moved from focusing on narrow revolutionary ideals to broadly emphasizing national strength and global standing. We can really identify three main paradigms in the official World War II narrative since 1949.
Let's start with the earliest one, the Maoist era, before the 1980s. What was the focus then?
During the Maoist era, the focus was overwhelmingly on revolutionary heroism. The memory of the war of resistance was fundamentally secondary to the narrative of the 1949 revolution itself.
So the war was just a prelude to the communist victory.
Exactly. The whole war was framed primarily as a stage for the Chinese Communist Party's vanguard role. Its revolutionary fervor, its heroism, its ultimate triumph over both the Japanese invaders and the rival nationalist forces.
And crucially, the focus was on fighting and victory.
Right. It largely avoided focusing on Chinese victimhood or Japanese atrocities, because that was seen as a sign of national weakness, which ran completely contrary to the ideology of revolutionary strength.
The war was just a pathway to revolution, not this major historical event in its own right. So when did that focus shift to the suffering?
The second paradigm, which we could call national victimization, emerged under Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin. So that's roughly from the 1980s to the early 2000s. And this shift was largely spurred by an internal ideological crisis.
What kind of crisis?
Well, with communist ideology losing its resonance, especially after Tiananmen, the party pivoted heavily to nationalism to shore up its legitimacy. And this new narrative explicitly centered on Chinese suffering at the hands of Japan. It established Japan as the external other.
And shifting to highlight victimization was a political strategy. What did that enable them to do?
It was strategically very powerful, both at home and internationally. Domestically, it created unity against an external historical enemy. Internationally, it gave rise to this fervent apology diplomacy.
Apology diplomacy, what does that mean exactly?
It means China could leverage its victim status to demand Japanese contrition and assert a kind of moral superiority. And importantly, this phase also required an adjustment in how they talked about their internal rivals, the nationalists, the Kuomintang, or KMT.
Because for decades, the KMT had been portrayed as enemies of the revolution.
Exactly. But now, for the first time, the KMT was often partially rehabilitated. They were regarded as fellow victims and martyrs, rather than just traitors or class enemies. This reflected a softening toward historical reconciliation, but also broader geostrategic goals, particularly regarding cross-strait cooperation.
But the core identity was still passive.
Yes. The focus was on the Chinese people as victims of external Japanese atrocities, not as the architects of their own victory.
Which brings us to the current and most ambitious paradigm, accelerating under Xi Jinping after 2005. The shift to national victory and national greatness. This seems designed to overcome that passive victim identity entirely.
This is a profound and very active reinterpretation. It's an aspirational, empowering retelling that moves definitively away from that passive victim trope.
And the memory of the war is elevated.
Dramatically. The victory in 1945 is now seen as absolutely rivaling the 1949 revolution as the critical turning point toward national rejuvenation. It's celebrated not just as the end of a defensive war, but as the moment China regained its standing among world powers.
How does that square with earlier Western accounts that so often minimize the China front? If the narrative is now all about greatness, does that mean they have to minimize the suffering to project strength?
That's a great question. It means reframing the suffering as evidence of resilience, not helplessness. The narrative now emphasizes that the war's victory reestablished China's status as a great power and won global respect, which led directly to its seat as a permanent member of the UN Security Council.
So the message is that a unified China is unconquerable.
That's the core of it. Furthermore, the narrative rehabilitates the wartime Second United Front, that uneasy alliance between the KMT and the CCP, to emphasize that it was the CCP's foresight in uniting and mobilizing the nation against great odds that allowed the Chinese people as a whole to secure the ultimate victory.
So what are the internal political goals achieved by emphasizing this national greatness narrative rather than just focusing on victimhood?
The internal goals are deeply tied to national unity and systemic confidence. The war experience is now framed as having forged a deep sense of unity among the Chinese people. It strengthened national consciousness and identity and weakened historical problems like regionalism and separatism.
It's a direct counter to that old idea of China being a pile of loose sand.
Exactly. The revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen famously lamented that China was just a pile of loose sand, disorganized, incapable of unified action. This victory narrative actively counters that historical image. By celebrating the war effort, the CCP shows that it laid the foundation for China's transformation into a highly organized, resilient, and unified nation, one capable of responding decisively to foreign aggression.
And this narrative is used heavily in education.
Oh, heavily. It's used to elevate confidence and pride, to provide historical proof that the current trajectory toward the Chinese dream is justified and inevitable, because the nation already proved its resilience in the face of the greatest possible challenge.
That shift from passive victim to decisive victor requires some really robust institutional backing to cement it in the public consciousness, right? Especially for younger generations.
You can't just rely on rhetoric. It needs infrastructure, curriculum, and law.
Which is where the Patriotic Education Campaign, or PEC, comes in.
The Patriotic Education Campaign is the primary large-scale engine for implementing and sustaining this new greatness narrative. It was initiated back in the early 1990s and has been continuously refined, most recently being codified into law in 2024.
And the goal is to link that historical sacrifice directly to today's national goals.
And to the CCP's legitimacy. Absolutely. It's designed to ensure future generations fully comprehend the complexities of the war in that specific light.
How does the campaign manage to blend these seemingly disparate themes like, ancient Chinese history and modern political legitimacy?
It operates on multiple levels. It strategically blends classical themes of Chinese history and tradition, like celebrating the Yellow Emperor or emphasizing traditional cultural values. This broadens the basis of legitimacy, shifting it from purely Marxist-Leninist ideology to a broad, unifying concept of patriotism rooted in 5,000 years of civilization.
And at the same time, it hammers home modern themes.
Right, like territorial integrity and national unity. The CCP is presented as the paramount patriotic force, the strong national leadership that prevented the nation's collapse against foreign aggression. It's a stark contrast with the corrupt and ineffective pre-war regimes.
Let's focus on the most direct tool of transmission, the school curriculum. How have the history textbooks actually changed under this new victory paradigm?
The curriculum is now structured to emphasize 4 key points, making the narrative really cohesive and empowering. First, viewing the full 14-year history of resistance as an integrated whole, starting definitively in 1931. Second, positioning the CCP as the central role and the mainstay of national unity throughout the entire conflict. Third, defining the Chinese battleground as the main eastern battlefield of the Second World War.
Not a side theater.
Not a side theater, but a decisive one. And finally, ensuring the narrative is unifying and aspirational, culminating in national triumph.
That sounds like a tightrope walk, especially when you're dealing with the contributions and, the failures of the nationalists, the KMT, who were fighting Japan at the same time. How does the curriculum handle that complexity without undermining the CCP's central role?
It requires a very selective and politically sophisticated policy of inclusivity and exclusion. The new narrative rehabilitates the Second United Front, that uneasy pact between the KMT and the CCP, as a major political achievement of the CCP.
How so?
It claims that it was the CCP's strategic genius that secured the national unity needed for victory. This allows the CCP to acknowledge KMT military successes, like the major defensive battles of Shanghai or Wuhan, but attribute them broadly to the Chinese military as a whole.
So it claims those victories as part of the unified nation it's spearheaded.
Exactly. And conversely, failures and betrayals are explicitly assigned to the nationalists. For example, the abandonment of Nanjing right before the massacre, or the high-profile collaboration of figures like Wang Jingwei, who headed a Japanese puppet government. These events are detailed.
To contrast with the CCP's loyalty.
To contrast its own steadfast loyalty and resistance with the nationalists' perceived weakness and collaboration. It maintains the CCP's image as the unwavering, resilient core of the nation.
And how is that terrible chapter of victimhood, the 35 million casualties, how is that handled in what's supposed to be an upbeat and empowering curriculum?
Victimhood has been strategically managed and, really, in structural terms, relegated. The overall narrative focuses on triumph. The explicit discussion of Japanese atrocities is often confined to a single powerful chapter.
But the facts are maintained.
Oh yes, the facts are maintained. For instance, citing the death toll of over 300,000 from the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal. But the focus very quickly shifts back to the spirit of resistance, resilience, and eventual Chinese military successes. The overarching message is survival and triumph, not prolonged national grief.
It sounds like the educational goal is not just the recitation of historical data, but the cultivation of an emotional commitment to this resilient national identity, something that really makes the lessons stick.
That's exactly right. The education goes beyond just rote learning. It seeks emotional resonance. For instance, think of Mrs. Liu, a history teacher in Harbin, a city near the notorious site of Imperial Japan's Unit 731.
The biological warfare unit.
Responsible for some of the most horrific experiments on humans during the war. Mrs. Liu avoids just listing abstract numbers of victims. Instead, she uses deeply personal sources, like having her students read a doctor's last letter to his family, a victim of the unit's experiments.
She wants to make history breathe.
That's her phrase. Her aim is not to instill abstract hatred, but to cultivate a powerful, intergenerational sense of empathy and a solemn responsibility to uphold the lessons of that victory. This targeted approach has been highly successful in aligning Chinese national identity with the CCP's leadership.
To the point where criticizing the party's historical narrative can seem unpatriotic.
Or even treasonous in the public eye.
And beyond the classroom, this is all reinforced physically through culture and national infrastructure, making the history inescapable.
Precisely. We see massive resources dedicated to the large-scale construction and renovation of patriotic education sites. By 2009, there were over 350 national-level sites, museums, memorials, historical parks. They serve as critical tools for nation building.
And they promote the new narrative.
Exactly. The National War of Resistance Museum in Beijing, for example, now has a permanent exhibition called Great Victory, Historical Contribution, which explicitly links that past triumph to the contemporary political vision of the Chinese dream and this idea of a community of common destiny for mankind.
This comprehensive national narrative is clearly powerful at home, but how does China leverage this specific historical memory on the international stage? This is the realm of memory diplomacy.
China leverages its World War II history to project its image internationally as a peace-loving, responsible major power, as a maker, not a breaker, of the post-war order. They claim a moral high ground based on their immense sacrifice against fascism.
And a key element is asserting their foundational role in establishing that post-war system.
Absolutely. China always points out that it was the first country to sign the UN Charter in 1945. This recognizes its status as one of the 4 key allies who defeated the Axis. And this historical fact affirms China's inherent right to advocate for and even strategically reform the international system today.
That's a direct challenge to any narrative that tries to portray China's modern influence as something new or suggesting it's an emerging power that hasn't earned its place.
Correct. And the memory diplomacy is also instrumental in safeguarding the legal and political outcomes of the war, especially when it comes to sovereignty. China frequently cites documents like the 1943 Cairo Declaration as the legal basis underpinning Beijing's claims to Taiwan and other disputed territories. The Cairo Declaration explicitly stated that all territories Japan had taken from China, like Taiwan, should be returned after the war.
So by continuously citing these World War II documents,
they link the sacrifices of that 14-year war directly to their modern territorial integrity. They reinforce the argument that these claims aren't just political aspirations, but are legally and morally mandated outcomes of the world anti-fascist victory.
So the overall message to the world is clear.
It's very clear. Acknowledge China's historic contribution to victory, recognize its established status as a great power, and embrace Chinese notions of global governance, like win-win cooperation. This historical foundation is actively used to legitimize China's position in global affairs today.
So if we connect all of this very detailed historical project to the bigger picture, China's position is really a profound statement. It's that knowledge is most valuable when it's understood and accurately applied.
Yes. The extensive, systematic effort to preserve the authentic narrative of World War II. This whole shift from passive victimhood to active national greatness and decisive global contribution, it's about far more than just remembering the past.
Right.
It's about establishing the moral and political foundation for China's status in the 21st century. It's about promoting regional and global peace based on comprehensive truth-telling, while fundamentally rejecting any historical revisionism that risks the resurgence of a dangerous militarism.
What we see here, then, is this deep, intricate link between domestic legitimacy, national unity, and foreign policy. China's determination to ensure the world recognizes its 14 years of sacrifice and its pivotal role in that anti-fascist victory is fundamentally tied to its current path towards national rejuvenation.
It's projecting an image of resilience and great power status that was forged in the fires of the longest, most costly front of the entire global war.
Indeed. By striving for an honest and comprehensive historical reflection, China seeks to ensure that the lessons paid for in immense blood and sacrifice are never forgotten, paving the way for a peace that is built on shared understanding and an enduring commitment to justice.